Microraptor was a small feathered theropod dinosaur that lived at the beginning of the Cretaceous, approximately between 131 and 120 million years ago, in the humid forests that covered what is now the province of Liaoning in northeastern China. It belongs to the group of dromaeosaurids, close relatives of more well-known forms such as Velociraptor, although its size, anatomy, and adaptations make it one of the most singular dinosaurs ever discovered. Its name, which means small thief, alludes both to its relationship with other predatory theropods and to its reduced body scale. The most striking feature of Microraptor is its extraordinary plumage. Unlike most dinosaurs known at the time of its discovery, this animal preserved complete impressions of long and complex feathers, not only on the arms and tail, but also on the hind legs. These feathers were of the pennaceous type, with well-developed rachis and barbs very similar in structure to the flight feathers of modern birds. The arrangement of this plumage gave rise to a unique body configuration, 4 functional wing surfaces, 2 on the forelimbs and 2 on the hind limbs, which led to it being described as a 4-winged dinosaur. The body of Microraptor was compact and lightweight. The best preserved specimens indicate a total length ranging between about 40 and 80 centimeters, with an estimated weight close to 1 kilogram. Its skeleton was gracile, with relatively thin bones and limbs adapted both for terrestrial locomotion and for life in the trees. The hands retained curved, sharp claws useful for climbing or grasping prey, while the feet also bore well-developed claws, reinforcing the idea of an animal with partially arboreal habits. The feathers of the forelimbs formed well-defined wings, with asymmetric flight feathers, a key feature in aerodynamics that suggests an active function in aerial movement. The feathers of the hind limbs were equally long and stiff, creating a second pair of wings that extended from the thigh to the ankle. This configuration has no direct equivalent among modern birds, but in some ways resembles present-day gliders, such as certain squirrels or reptiles that use membranes to move between trees. In Microraptor, however, these surfaces were formed exclusively by feathers. The tail also played an important role. It was long, bony, and covered with feathers, some of which were especially elongated in the distal region. In several fossils, these caudal feathers form a kind of fan or sail, which probably acted as a stabilizer during gliding, helping to maintain balance and to perform maneuvers in the air. The combination of forewings, hind wings, and a feathered tail suggests that Microraptor was well adapted to moving in 3 dimensions within a dense forest environment. The debate over its ability to fly has been central since its discovery. Most interpretations agree that Microraptor was not an active flyer comparable to modern birds, but rather a very efficient glider. It probably launched itself from elevated branches and descended in a controlled manner toward other trees or toward the ground, using its 4 wings to generate lift and reduce the speed of descent. Some aerodynamic models have proposed different flight postures, including configurations with the hind limbs extended laterally or slightly backward, which would have allowed precise control during gliding. As for its diet, Microraptor was clearly carnivorous. Exceptional fossils have been found that preserve remains of prey within the body, including bones of small primitive birds and fish scales. This indicates that its diet was varied and opportunistic, capable of capturing animals both on the ground and in the trees, and even in environments close to water. Its teeth were small, sharp, and recurved, suitable for holding small prey and preventing them from escaping. The behavior of Microraptor was probably closely linked to the forests in which it lived. The combination of curved claws, developed feathers, and low body weight points to an agile animal, capable of climbing, jumping, and moving among the tree canopies. In this environment, gliding would have been an efficient strategy to save energy, escape from larger predators, and quickly access new hunting areas. From a taxonomic point of view, several species have been described within the genus Microraptor, such as Microraptor jowianus, Microraptor gui, and Microraptor hanchingi. However, there is debate as to whether these differences represent distinct species or individual, sexual, or age-related variations within a single species. Even so, all specimens share the fundamental characteristics that define the genus, especially the plumage on all 4 limbs. The importance of Microraptor goes beyond its anatomical rarity. Its discovery provided key evidence for the evolutionary link between theropod dinosaurs and birds, demonstrating that complex feathers and aerial adaptations did not appear suddenly, but through a series of intermediate stages. Microraptor shows that before active flight, there were dinosaurs that were already exploring the air through gliding, using combinations of feathers and body structures that today may seem strange but were essential in the evolutionary history of flight. Longisquama. Longisquama was a strange and unconventional reptile that inhabited the Earth more than 230 million years ago during the Middle or Late Triassic, long before the appearance of the classic dinosaurs. Its name literally means long scales, a term that describes the elongated and exceptional structures that protruded from its body and made it one of the most enigmatic fossils ever found. These remains come from the Madigan Formation in what is now Kyrgyzstan and are known mainly from a single type specimen and several impressions of possible dermal appendages preserved in rock. The animal was formally described in 1970 by the Russian paleontologist Alexander Sharov on the basis of these fragmentary fossils. At first glance, Longisquama looks more like a small lizard-like reptile than any dinosaur. Evidence suggests that it did not exceed 10 to 15 centimeters in length, which would place it on a scale similar to that of many modern lizards, with a light body, slender limbs, and a body structure that indicates a possible adaptation to life in trees. What makes Longisquama truly remarkable are its long, thin structures projected from the skin along the back. These extensions consisted of rigid bundles that were not part of the skeleton itself, but instead emerged from the surface of the body, arranging themselves longitudinally along the dorsal region. The exact function of these structures has been the subject of intense debate. Some researchers have interpreted them as elements that might have helped the animal glide between trees, while others argue that they were simply visual display structures, possibly used in mating behaviors or as warnings to predators. Initially, after its discovery, the long scales of Longisquama attracted the attention of some paleontologists who were seeking answers about the origin of flight in birds. Because these superficial structures bore some morphological resemblance to the primitive feathers of other feathered dinosaur fossils, some proposed that Longisquama might have been a proto-bird form or an early ancestor of birds. This idea fit with older evolutionary models that suggested birds could have descended from arboreal reptiles with specialized dermal structures. However, most paleontologists today reject this interpretation. The current scientific consensus holds that birds evolved directly from theropod dinosaurs and that feather-like structures in other primitive reptiles either arose independently or are not evolutionarily related to true feathers. In the case of Longisquama, the evidence strongly suggests that it was an ambiguous diapsid, that is, a reptile with skeletal characteristics that are difficult to classify precisely within the major known reptile groups, and not a direct ancestor of birds. The skeleton of Longisquama is extremely fragmentary, making it difficult to accurately reconstruct its complete morphology. Based on the available remains, not enough diagnostic features have been found to place it with certainty within well-established groups such as dinosaurs or pterosaurs. Some studies have provisionally affiliated it with groups close to archosaurs, the broader group that includes crocodiles, dinosaurs, and birds, while others suggest similarities with more distantly related lineages, such as Drepanosauromorphs, a group of archaic reptiles with adaptations to arboreal life. The dorsal structures that define Longisquama are particularly unique in the fossil record. Unlike the true feathers of feathered dinosaurs, they do not appear to be composed of complex, branching filaments. Instead, they consist of long elements, often described as leaves or bundles of rigid dermal tissue that arched backward from the body. Some researchers have compared their shape to a row of small hockey sticks attached to the animal's back, although their internal structure is not homogeneous with that of bird feathers. Functional interpretations of these structures have varied over time. One hypothesis suggested that they might have served as a gliding apparatus or even rudimentary aerodynamic structures, allowing Longisquama to move from branch to branch in Triassic forests. Another possibility is that these structures had a social or visual purpose, functioning in a manner similar to the ornamentation seen in many modern animals such as display colors and plumage. It has also been proposed that they could have served to intimidate predators or rivals. increasing the apparent size of the body without providing a real flight function. Finally, some proposals consider them possible thermal or sensory adaptations, although direct evidence for these ideas is limited. Whatever their exact function, Longisquama represents an exceptional evolutionary experiment in the history of reptiles. Its combination of a relatively simple reptilian body with these extraordinary dermal structures has no clear parallels among other known fossils. The animal itself, small in size and light in morphology, suggests that it may have led an agile life among dense vegetation, probably feeding on small invertebrates such as insects found in its arboreal environment, although dietary details are not well documented due to the scarcity of direct fossil remains. To this day, the interpretation of Longisquama continues to be the subject of research and discussion. Some new perspectives on Triassic reptiles, including recent discoveries of other genera with complex cutaneous appendages, have revived interest in how advanced surface structures developed in different lineages of primitive reptiles, though without directly linking them to the origin of birds or avian flight. Incisivosaurus. Incisivosaurus was a strange and uncommon theropod dinosaur that lived approximately 125 million years ago during the Barremian stage of the early Cretaceous in what is now Liaoning province in northeastern China within the rich sediments of the Yixian Formation. This animal has captured the attention of paleontologists mainly because of its surprisingly unusual dentition for a theropod. While most theropods were carnivorous and many derived groups, such as the more advanced oviraptorosaurs, even lost their teeth to develop a beak, Incisivosaurus displayed a pair of exaggeratedly large front incisors, similar in appearance to the teeth of modern rodents. These front teeth were flat, broad, and showed clear signs of wear, suggesting that this dinosaur regularly processed vegetation or hard material, a highly atypical trait for a typical theropod. The name Incisivosaurus literally means incisor lizard, in direct reference to these striking front teeth, and the specific name Gautieri honors the paleontologist Dr. Jacques Gautier for his contributions to the phylogenetic classification of dinosaurs. Its only formally described specimen consists of a nearly complete skull approximately 10 centimeters in length, which preserves the most complete dentition known to date among primitive oviraptorosaurs. The structure of the Incisivosaurus skull was distinctive. It had a relatively long snout, making up nearly half of the total skull length, and a slender lower jaw with an elongated mandibular fenestra, that is, an opening in the lower part of the jaw, as well as many smaller teeth behind the incisors. These combined features place it at the base of the oviraptorosaur group, making it more primitive than forms such as Caudipteryx and the derived oviraptorids, which developed toothless beaks toward the end of the Cretaceous. Most advanced oviraptorosaurs lacked teeth and possessed robust beaks adapted for varied diets, which makes the toothed condition of Incisivosaurus especially valuable for understanding the transition from toothed forms to beaked ones. The presence of so many teeth, especially the large incisors, indicates that Incisivosaurus retained archaic characteristics within its group, preserving a complete dentition while its more derived relatives were losing it. The overall morphology suggests that Incisivosaurus was probably herbivorous or omnivorous. Studies of dental wear show patterns consistent with the consumption of plants, and although the possibility of eating small animals cannot be ruled out, the shape of the teeth, particularly the presence of broad front incisors, points to a functional adaptation for chewing tough plant material. This contrasts with most theropods, which used sharper, curved teeth to cut meat. Beyond its dentition, it is likely that Incisivosaurus, like other members of the oviraptorosaur clade, had feathers on some part of its body. Although the holotype does not preserve direct evidence of feathers, studies of other closely related theropods show that many had coverings of filamentous, feather-like structures for insulation and possibly display. Based on phylogenetic relationships, scientists assume that Incisivosaurus would also have had some type of primitive plumage, though not necessarily for flight, but probably for thermal insulation or social communication. The position of Incisivosaurus within the oviraptorosaurs has been the subject of debate among paleontologists. In many cladistic analyses, it remains one of the most basal forms of the group, often considered a close relative of Protarchaeopteryx, another primitive theropod with mixed traits between archaic and derived forms. The evidence that both share a series of primitive features such as dentition supports this taxonomic placement. However, the lack of additional complete fossils means that this relationship has not yet been fully resolved. In addition to its distinctive morphology, more recent studies have explored functional aspects such as bite force in Incisivosaurus. Comparisons with other oviraptorosaurs suggest that, although small, it may have had a surprisingly powerful bite relative to its body weight, which would have facilitated feeding on tough or fibrous vegetation, reinforcing the hypothesis that this dinosaur occupied a primitive and specialized niche among its relatives. The geological context of the Yixian Formation in which Incisivosaurus was found also provides clues about its living environment. This formation is part of the famous Jehol biota, a lacustrine ecosystem of the early Cretaceous known for its extraordinary preservation of dinosaurs, early birds, mammals and plants, all preserved with fine detail. The sediments indicate a varied environment of lakes, forests and abundant vegetation, which would have offered a suitable habitat for a small herbivorous or omnivorous dinosaur that could have foraged among plants, fruits, and perhaps also insects or small vertebrates. Tsintaosaurus. Tsintaosaurus was a herbivorous ornithischian dinosaur from the hadrosaur group, known primarily for its mysterious and distinctive cranial crest, which attracted the attention of paleontologists for decades. It lived in what is now Shandong province in eastern China during the late Cretaceous, approximately between 83 and 72 million years ago, in sediments of the Jingangku Formation of the Wangshu Group, a region that, due to its geological conditions, preserved abundant dinosaur remains from this period. The genus Tsintaosaurus contains a single well-recognized species, Tsintaosaurus spinorhinus, first described in 1958 by the Chinese paleontologist Yang Zhongjian on the basis of a nearly complete skull and some associated post-cranial remains. The genus name derives from Tsingtao, an old Western transliteration of Qingdao, a city near the discovery site, combined with the Greek word saurios, literally meaning lizard of Qingdao. The specific name spinorhinus refers to the crest or spine of the snout that Young initially identified when describing the species. Tsintaosaurus measured around 10 meters in length with an estimated weight of 3 tons, which places it among medium-sized hadrosaurs when compared with other members of its family. It possessed the characteristic duckbill that defines hadrosaurs, formed by a wide, flattened snout that ended in a toothless, keratinous edge at the front, behind which was a complex dental battery designed to grind tough vegetation. This combination of beak and teeth indicates effective adaptations for chewing plant material in a manner very different from that seen in carnivorous theropods, with specialized grinding surfaces that facilitated the processing of fibrous plants in large quantities. The body of Tsintaosaurus, like that of other hadrosaurs, was robust and adapted primarily for quadrupedal locomotion, supporting itself on 4 limbs while walking or grazing. However, it had the ability to rear up on its hind limbs, especially if it needed to reach higher vegetation or survey its surroundings for predators. Its tail was long and muscular, acting as a counterbalance and helping both in movement and in maintaining balance, particularly in bipedal postures. The cranial structure of Tsintaosaurus has been the main focus of debate since its discovery. The holotype preserved a raised bony projection over the snout, initially interpreted as a unicorn horn-shaped crest that projected almost vertically from the top of the muzzle. This feature was unique among hadrosaurs discovered up to that time, as its lambeosaurine relatives usually have more lobed or curved crests. Young's original interpretation and early representations depicted it with this very prominent nasal spine, which reinforced the image of Tsintaosaurus as a truly singular animal among its congeners. Nevertheless, during the 20th century, some paleontologists, including David Weishampel and Jack Horner, seriously questioned whether this crest was genuine or simply the result of deformation of the fossil during fossilization, or even whether the remains might belong to a mixed individual of 2 species, a situation known as a chimera. This uncertainty led some researchers to propose that without the distinctive crest, Tsintaosaurus could be synonymous with other hadrosaurs known from the region, such as Tanius. The controversy was partially resolved with new analyses and a reinterpretation of the fossil material in later studies, particularly a significant work published in 2013 by Albert Prieto Marquez and Jonathan Wagner. This study determined that the structure initially identified as a horn was in fact only the posterior part of a much larger cranial crest, which began at the tip of the snout and extended upward and backward, forming a more complex organ. In this new reconstruction, the premaxillary elements, that is, the front bones of the snout, integrated with the nasal bones to form a complete crest that would have been internally hollow, as in other lambeosaurines, although with characteristics unique to Tsintaosaurus. This implied that the true shape of the crest was different from the rigid horn that had previously been popularized and more closely resembled an aerodynamic or resonant wing-like structure that may have served for acoustic communication. These hollow and channeled crests in lambeosaurines are often related to the production of vocalizations or visual display signals. In other species, the air passages within the crest could function as resonance chambers, amplifying sounds for communication within the herd or during courtship. Although the specific shape of the Tsintaosaurus crest is unique, its presence suggests that this dinosaur also had some type of adaptation for social communication or display, a common characteristic within its subfamily Lambeosaurinae. From a taxonomic point of view, Tsintaosaurus is placed within the subfamily Lambeosaurinae, a group of hadrosaurs known for their complex cranial crests. In more recent cladistic analyses, it has been proposed that Tsintaosaurus forms part of a tribe called Tsintaosaurini, together with other genera such as Pararhabdodon, indicating a close phylogenetic relationship between these European and Asian lambeosaurines during the late Cretaceous. This placement helps to better understand the diversity and dispersal of lambeosaurine hadrosaurs in the Old World before the final extinction of non-avian dinosaurs. The paleoecology of Tsintaosaurus suggests that this dinosaur inhabited fluvial environments, alluvial plains, and areas near lakes, where abundant vegetation provided a constant food source for its herbivorous diet. Its dental battery, capable of grinding leaves, stems, and other fibrous plant material, indicates an effective specialization in the digestion and processing of plants, a trait that allowed hadrosaurs to successfully occupy large expanses of the Cretaceous landscape. Pegomastax. Pegomastax was a small, extraordinarily rare herbivorous ornithischian dinosaur that lived about 200 million years ago during the early Jurassic in what is now southern Africa, specifically in rocks of the Elliott Formation in South Africa. The only known species, named Pegomastax africana, was formally described in 2012 by the paleontologist Paul Sereno, based on remains that had been discovered decades earlier but had remained unidentified until then. The name Pegomastax comes from Greek and literally means strong jaw, a feature that highlights the robustness of its lower jaw, while the specific epithet africana refers to the place where it was found. The holotype, catalogued as SAMPKK 10488, consists of a partial skull that includes bones of the upper and lower jaw and the predentary, the front bone that would have supported a horny beak. This dinosaur measured approximately 60 centimeters in length from head to tail, making it one of the smallest dinosaurs known. Its complete body has been estimated through comparisons with other heterodontosaurids, and although only the skull is preserved, the overall proportions suggest a light, very small animal, similar in length to a small dog or a domestic cat. The shape of Pegomastax's head is one of its most striking features. The skull was relatively short, with a straight snout tip that supported a parrot-like horny beak. This beak, clearly adapted for a herbivorous diet, would have been used to pluck and cut vegetation. Behind the beak, in both the upper and lower jaws, there were teeth specifically arranged for chewing tough plants, with dental crowns that overlapped during chewing, indicating a specialized adaptation for processing hard vegetation. Contrary to the image that a small and delicate herbivore might evoke, Pegomastax also had prominent forward-projecting canines resembling vampire fangs. Although today this type of dentition may seem strange in a vegetarian dinosaur, analysis of dental wear suggests that these fangs were not intended for cutting meat, but probably served functions of defense against predators, fighting with rivals, or visual display within the species. Comparative evidence suggests that these teeth, as in some modern mammals such as antlered deer, may have been used for biting or digging up roots and tough stems, or simply as a defensive tool. The family to which Pegomastax belongs, the Heterodontosauridae, is an early and primitive group within the ornithischians, characterized by having teeth of different shapes, or heterodonty, something relatively unusual among dinosaurs. In Pegomastax, this heterodonty is expressed mainly in a beak adapted for cutting plants, a battery of posterior teeth for grinding fibrous vegetation, and the prominent canines described above. The placement of Pegomastax within the family Heterodontosauridae also provides significant information about the early evolution of herbivorous dinosaurs. Heterodontosaurids are considered one of the first groups of herbivorous dinosaurs to be efficiently adapted, and probably one of the lineages that most rapidly diversified plant-feeding strategies among early Jurassic dinosaurs. In recent phylogenetic analyses, Pegomastax has been found to be closely related to other South American genera such as manidans, suggesting interesting biogeographic connections among dinosaurs of the Southern Hemisphere during that early era. The environment in which Pegomastax lived was a relatively dry plain with rivers and seasonal bodies of water, composed of a diversity of low-growing and shrubby vegetation that provided abundant food for small herbivorous animals. It shared its ecosystem with several other primitive dinosaurs, including early sauropods, other ornithischians, small theropods, and synapsids, forming a complex web of ecological relationships in a world undergoing climatic and continental change. Despite the fact that only a single fossil specimen of Pegomastax has been found, the impact of this discovery on understanding the beginnings of herbivory among ornithischian dinosaurs is considerable. More than 50 years have passed since the remains were excavated in South Africa, but they remained in collections without being described until Paul Sereno finally examined them and recognized them as a new genus, underscoring how seemingly forgotten pieces in scientific collections can reveal significant discoveries decades later. Therizinosaurus. Therizinosaurus was one of the strangest and most fascinating dinosaurs ever discovered, a giant with unusual proportions and features that challenged the understanding of paleontologists for decades. Its name comes from the Greek therizo, to reap, and sauros, meaning literally scythe lizard, in direct reference to the enormous claws of its hands, the longest known among terrestrial animals. It lived approximately 70 million years ago, in the late Cretaceous or Maastrichtian in what is now Mongolia, especially in the Nemegt formation of the Gobi Desert, a place famous for its rich and varied dinosaur fossils. The first remains of Therizinosaurus cheloniformis, which is the only valid species within the genus, were recovered in 1948 by a joint Soviet-Mongolian expedition and were formally described in 1954 by the paleontologist Evgeny Malev. Initially, the gigantic claw bones were interpreted as belonging to a giant marine turtle, which inspired the specific name cheloniformis, meaning turtle-shaped. It was not until decades later, when many more fossils of close relatives were discovered, that it became clear that these remains belonged to a uniquely adapted theropod dinosaur, not to a turtle. Therizinosaurus was a very prominent member of the group Therizinosauria, a clade of theropods that evolved in a very different way from the typical carnivorous pattern of their relatives. While most theropods, such as Tyrannosaurus or Velociraptor, were bipedal predators with sharp teeth, Therizinosaurs underwent an evolutionary shift toward a herbivorous or omnivorous diet, retaining many primitive features in their skeleton but adopting unique adaptations that reflect their unconventional lifestyle. Estimates based on fragmentary remains and comparisons with other therizinosaurs suggest that Therizinosaurus could reach between 9 and 10 meters in length, 4 to 5 meters in height, and weigh between 3 and more than 5 tons. These figures place it not only among the largest members of its family, but also as one of the largest maniraptors ever known, rivaling other giants such as Deinocheirus. The most striking feature of Therizinosaurus was its extremely long and robust arms, which could measure around 2.5 meters in length in adult individuals. Each hand had 3 fingers ending in gigantic claws, which could exceed 50 centimeters in length in the bone alone, and possibly nearly a meter if the keratinous covering they would have had in life is included. These scythe-shaped claws are undoubtedly the morphological feature that has most impressed both scientists and the general public. For a long time, the function of these intricately formed claws was the subject of speculation. Although it is now known that they were not specialized tools for hunting large prey, given that it was herbivorous, it is likely that it used them to pull down or strip vegetation from high branches, helping it access foliage that other shorter herbivores could not reach. It has also been suggested that they may have served in defense against predators as a form of visual or physical deterrence, and possibly in intraspecific interactions, for example competition or courtship, although their fragility in the face of hard impacts limits their ability to be used as blunt weapons. Unlike most theropods, which have 3 functional toes on the hind limbs with the first toe reduced, Therizinosaurus had 4 functional toes on its feet, a characteristic more common in more primitive groups of herbivorous dinosaurs. This probably provided it with a stable base to support the weight of its enormous body and its wide belly, which housed a specialized digestive system to process large quantities of plant matter. Its pelvis was wide and robust, and although the complete skull of Therizinosaurus has not yet been found, evidence from close relatives suggests that it had a keratinous beak at the front of the jaw and teeth adapted for cutting and tearing vegetation. The neck of Therizinosaurus was relatively long, which, together with its highly specialized forelimbs, would have allowed it to reach higher branches in the vegetation than other contemporary herbivores. The rest of its skeleton is reconstructed mainly by comparison with better preserved Therizinosaurs, but it is thought that it maintained a bipedal posture, walking on 2 legs while using its arms and claws to manipulate the environment and obtain food. The evolutionary history of Therizinosaurus and its relatives has been a puzzle for scientists. Initially, it was thought that its remains might belong to marine reptiles or even to giant sauropods because of the strangeness of its anatomy. But with the discovery of more complete therizinosaurs in Asia and North America, it became clear that these animals were deeply modified theropods related to birds and other maniraptors, but that they developed herbivory independently within their lineage. This evolutionary convergence with other herbivores shows the adaptive flexibility of theropods, which were able to explore ecological niches very different from those of their carnivorous ancestors. The environment in which Therizinosaurus lived, represented by the sediments of the Nemegt Formation, was varied with alluvial plains, wetlands, and forested areas that would have provided abundant vegetation to sustain this gigantic herbivore. In this landscape, it coexisted with other herbivorous dinosaurs and iconic predators of late Cretaceous Asia, contributing to a diverse and complex ecological community. Amargasaurus. Amargasaurus was a distinctive herbivorous sauropod dinosaur that lived during the early Cretaceous, approximately 130 million years ago, in what is now Argentine Patagonia, mainly in sediments of the La Amarga Formation. The only known genus and species, Amargasaurus kazaui, has become one of the most iconic and enigmatic sauropods of its time thanks to a nearly complete skeleton that includes a fragmentary skull, something rather uncommon among fossils of large herbivorous sauropods. The etymology of the name reflects both its discovery and its place of origin. Amargasaurus literally means La Amarga lizard, referring to the stream where its remains were unearthed. The specific epithet kazaui honors the geologist Luis B. Cazau, who identified the paleontological importance of the site. In terms of size, Amargasaurus was relatively small for a sauropod, reaching estimated lengths of between 9 and 10 meters, with some reports suggesting specimens even slightly larger based on reconstructions of the vertebral column and the complete body. Unlike giants such as Brachiosaurus or Apatosaurus, its body was more compact and lighter, a trait shared with other members of its family, the Dicraeosauridae, which are characterized by shorter necks and smaller bodies compared to other classic sauropods. The basic anatomy of Amargasaurus followed the typical sauropod body plan: a relatively elongated neck, a voluminous trunk supported by 4 robust limbs, a long tail, and a small skull in proportion to the body. Its neck, however, was shorter than usual for a sauropod, measuring around 2.4 meters, which suggests that it did not access extremely high vegetation like others in its group, but probably fed at intermediate heights, with the snout positioned between approximately 80 centimeters and 2.7 meters above the ground. What truly distinguishes Amargasaurus from any other dinosaur is the presence of 2 parallel rows of extremely elongated neural spines that emerge along its neck and part of its back. These bony structures project vertically from the vertebrae and are taller than in any other known sauropod, reaching in some vertebrae near the middle of the neck up to 60 centimeters in height in bone alone, and probably more if they were covered by tissue or keratin in life. The spines were not simple single extensions, they were bifurcated along their length, essentially forming two rows of parallel spikes running from the posterior region of the skull to the middle of the back, where they gradually decrease in size. The bifurcation of these spines is a typical characteristic of dicraeosaurids, although in Amargasaurus this modification reached a particularly exaggerated development. The function of these spines has been the subject of debate among paleontologists for years. One proposal is that they may have supported one or two skin sails, superficial structures similar to those observed in other extinct animals such as Spinosaurus, or even in primitive pelycosaurs like Dimetrodon, with possible functions related to thermoregulation, visual display, or intraspecific signaling. However, this hypothesis is not universal and has been questioned because the spines of Amargasaurus are circular in cross-section rather than flattened, a shape that is less efficient for supporting a large continuous skin sail. An alternative is that the spines simply protruded as independent bony structures, perhaps covered by keratin sheaths, which would have increased their length and turned them into a kind of armor or visual weapon. In this scenario, the spines could have served as defense against predators or as a display feature to intimidate rivals or attract mates, taking advantage of their large size and high visibility in an open environment. The striated surfaces observed on some spines suggest that soft tissues may have been associated with them, although the exact living appearance remains unclear. The presence of such pronounced spines would also have had implications for the animal's posture and mobility. The long cervical spines may have limited neck flexion, restricting the maximum height of the snout and forcing the animal to keep its neck more horizontal than vertical while grazing. Anatomical studies have indicated that Amargasaurus could not raise its head extremely high due to these structures and the articulation of the vertebrae themselves. Taxonomically, Amargasaurus belongs to the family Dicraeosauridae, a group within the diplodocoid sauropods that includes genera such as Dicraeosaurus, Brachytrachelepon, and Suwassia. Dicraeosaurids in general differ from other sauropods by having shorter necks and relatively compact bodies, as well as the presence of more prominent neural spines. Among these, Amargasaurus is the only dicraeosaurid known from the early Cretaceous, as most of its relatives date to the Jurassic, making it an interesting temporal link for understanding the diversity and survival of the lineage. The remains of the only known individual were discovered in 1984 and formally described in 1991 by Argentine paleontologists Leonardo Salgado and José F. Bonaparte, establishing Amargasaurus kazaui as a valid genus and species within the dicraeosaurids. The relatively complete preservation of the skeleton, including numerous articulated vertebrae, has allowed scientists to reconstruct much of its anatomy and to consider functional and ecological aspects with greater precision than in many other sauropods. Paleoecologically, Amargasaurus coexisted with other herbivorous sauropods in the same region, suggesting a significant diversity of giant herbivores occupying different niches, probably feeding at different heights or on different types of vegetation to reduce competition for resources. Its diet would have consisted of plants available in relatively open and wooded plains of early Cretaceous Patagonia, using its neck to reach accessible foliage without directly competing with dinosaurs with much longer necks or with smaller herbivores. Pachyrhinosaurus. Pachyrhinosaurus was a distinctive herbivorous ceratopsian dinosaur that lived at the end of the late Cretaceous period, approximately between 73 and 68 million years ago, in what is now North America, with remains found in Alberta, Canada, and Alaska, United States. The name Pachyrhinosaurus comes from Greek and means thick-nosed lizard, a direct reference to the most characteristic cranial structure of this dinosaur, which differs significantly from the pointed horns typical of other ceratopsids by having a massive, flattened bony protrusion on the snout instead of a pointed nasal horn. Ceratopsids are known for their horny beaks, large skulls adorned with horns and bony frills that extend behind the head, and for being efficient herbivores that processed tough, fibrous vegetation with specialized teeth. Pachyrhinosaurus belongs to the subfamily Centrosaurinae, a group within the ceratopsians that generally displays prominent cranial ornamentation and shorter, more robust frills than those of the Chasmosaurinae group, to which, for example, Triceratops belongs. Pachyrhinosaurus reached considerable sizes. Individuals of Pachyrhinosaurus canadensis probably measured between 6 and 8 meters in length and weighed between 1.8 and 4 tons, comparable in size to a modern truck. Its body was heavily built, with robust limbs supporting a body structure adapted to carry its heavy skull and powerful musculature. What stands out most in Pachyrhinosaurus is the thick, flattened, bony structure on the snout, known as the nasal boss. Instead of the long, bony spikes that many people associate with ceratopsids, this enormous protrusion was wide and coarse, resembling a trunk or a thickened, bony mass. In some species, there were also smaller protrusions above the eyes, and the frill behind the head could bear small additional horns or ornaments that varied among individuals and species. The function of this nasal boss has been interpreted in several ways. One prominent hypothesis is that it was used during intraspecific interactions such as ritualized combat or head-pushing between males, in a manner similar to modern musk oxen, which use their horns or bony bosses to compete for territory or mates. Another possibility is that this thickening acted as a visual ornament for display to other members of the species, indicating age, sex, or social status, given that its shape and size appear to vary among species and individuals. 3 valid species have been identified within the genus Pachyrhinosaurus. Pachyrhinosaurus canadensis, described as the type species and the first to be named by Charles M. Sternberg in 1950, based on incomplete skulls found in Alberta in 1945 and 1946. Pachyrhinosaurus lacustai, formally described in 2008 based on an extraordinarily rich fossil bed containing bones from at least 14 skulls of individuals of different sizes and ages, and Pachyrhinosaurus perotorum, identified in 2013 from material originating in northern Alaska, considerably expanding the geographic and ecological range of the genus northward. All of these finds belong to strata deposited during the Campanian-Maastrichtian stages, the final phases of the Cretaceous between about 73 and 68 million years ago, shortly before the mass extinction that wiped out non-avian dinosaurs. The skull of Pachyrhinosaurus was robust and occupied a significant proportion of the total body length. Although the presence of frill bones and the typical ceratopsian horny beak indicates that it was well adapted to cutting and gathering low and mid-height vegetation, the massive bony pads on the snout and above the eyes suggest that visual and tactile communication between individuals may have been very important. Within the frill, small backward-pointing horns are also often observed, whose exact function is still debated, but which undoubtedly added complexity to the visual pattern displayed by these dinosaurs. The teeth of Pachyrhinosaurus were strong and adapted to grinding fibrous plants, such as tough leaves, stems, and heterogeneous vegetation that was difficult to process. These teeth were located mainly in the cheeks behind the horny beak, forming an efficient dental battery that allowed a cyclical chewing motion, a complex trait that improves the digestion of coarse plant material, similar to the adaptations seen in other advanced ceratopsians. The social behavior of Pachyrhinosaurus has also been interpreted from fossil sites containing the remains of multiple individuals of different ages buried together, indicating that these dinosaurs likely moved in herds or complex social groups. The presence of juveniles alongside adults suggests that they may have cared for their offspring for extended periods, and that herds offered protection against predators, a behavior seen in some modern animals that group together to breed and migrate collectively. The environment in which Pachyrhinosaurus lived was varied and dynamic. In Alberta and Alaska during the late Cretaceous, extensive coastal plains, forests, and river floodplains provided abundant vegetation to sustain large populations of herbivorous dinosaurs. Climatic conditions varied with latitude, with Alaska experiencing colder winters compared to southern regions, which may have influenced differences in growth and behavior among species, as suggested by evidence of growth bands in northern fossil bones. The study of Pachyrhinosaurus has also helped to explain the morphological diversity within centrosaurine ceratopsians, a group characterized by extreme variations in skull shape and display structures. The tribe Pachyrhinosaurini, which includes Pachyrhinosaurus along with other genera such as Achylosaurus and Einiosaurus, is distinguished by having complex cranial ornamentation instead of prominent horns, showing how these dinosaurs explored different strategies of signaling and competition without losing their functionality as specialized herbivores. Nomingia. Nomingia was an unusual theropod dinosaur from the late Upper Cretaceous, which lived about 70 million years ago in what is now Mongolia, specifically in sediments of the Nemegt Formation in the Gobi Desert region. This animal is known for being one of the few oviraptorosaurs discovered in Asia with an extremely specialized tail structure, and for this reason it has been the subject of scientific attention since its description in the year 2000 by Rinchen Barsbold and colleagues. The genus and type species Nomingia gobiensis takes its name from the region where the remains were found, Nomingian Gobi, a part of the Gobi Desert that inspired both the generic name and the specific descriptor. The original fossils, including most of the vertebral column, the pelvic girdle, and part of the left hind leg, were discovered in 1994 and later described as a new theropod dinosaur with distinctive characteristics. Taxonomically, Nomingia is classified within the oviraptorosaurs, a group of maniraptoran theropods characterized by specialized cranial and postcranial structures, including toothless beaks in derived forms and adaptations for varied diets. Although Barsbold and collaborators initially assigned it broadly within the oviraptorosaurs, considering it probably part of the canagnathids or Elmisarinae, subsequent cladistic analyses have produced contradictory results regarding its exact taxonomic position. Some studies even suggest that Nomingia gobiensis could be synonymous with the genus Elmisaurus, a canagnathid known from fragmentary remains in the same region, although this point is still subject to scientific debate. One of the most extraordinary features of Nomingia is its highly modified tail, especially the presence of a pygostyle, that is, a bone formed by the fusion of the distal vertebrae of the tail, similar to the structure found in modern birds and which serves as an anchoring point for the tail feather fan. Before the discovery of Nomingia, this structure was known only in birds, and its presence in a non-avian dinosaur represented a significant surprise for paleontologists studying the evolution of maniraptorans. The pygostyle in Nomingia is composed of the fusion of the last 5 caudal vertebrae, and the animal's total tail was comparatively short with only about 24 vertebrae before the fused region. This type of specialized tail suggests that Nomingia supported a fan of feathers at the end of the tail, similar to that of other species such as Caudipteryx, although it was not designed for flight. It is more likely that these tail feathers served for visual display or intraspecific communication, reinforcing signals of status or attraction during courtship or social interactions within the population. The presence of a pygostyle points to complex behavioral and morphological adaptations reminiscent of modern birds, although Nomingia itself would not have had the ability to fly. Beyond the tail, Nomingia gobiensis also displays other characteristics consistent with its classification as an oviraptorosaur. It is estimated that the animal measured about 1.7 meters in length and weighed approximately 20 kilograms, a medium size for a non-avian oviraptorosaur. Its body was bipedal and lightweight, with hind limbs well adapted for walking or running, and jaws that, although not fully preserved, were probably equipped with a toothless beak or with a significant reduction of teeth, as seen in other related members of the group. Beaked jaws in canagnathids are typically associated with omnivorous or herbivorous diets, and it is assumed that Nomingia may have had varied feeding habits, consuming everything from vegetation to small invertebrates or other matter available in its environment. In addition to tail adaptations and the general structure of the skeleton, Nomingia may have had a cranial crest or bony protrusions used for visual display, although the associated cranial remains are fragmentary and incomplete, making a detailed reconstruction of the head and its ornamentation difficult. The presence of beaks and possible crests suggests that, like other oviraptorosaurs, these animals relied heavily on visual signals during social or competitive interactions. The discovery of Nomingia in Mongolia provides important data on the morphological and ecological diversity of oviraptorosaurs in Asia during the Maastrichtian. The Nemegt Formation is a fossil-rich site containing theropod dinosaurs, including other oviraptorosaurs, carnivorous theropods, and a diverse assemblage of herbivorous sauropods and ceratopsians, suggesting a complex ecosystem in which different forms of life coexisted and competed for resources. The presence of a pygostyle in Nomingia reinforces the idea that Maniraptorans developed advanced tail structures independently or convergently in several lineages close to birds, reflecting a marked evolutionary trend toward plumage adaptations with functions beyond flight. From an evolutionary perspective, the tail of Nomingia represents one of the clearest examples of structural convergence between non-avian dinosaurs and birds. The appearance of a pygostyle in multiple Maniraptoran lineages, including some distinct oviraptorosaurs, indicates that selective pressures to develop efficient terminal plumage systems were strong, probably driven by the importance of visual and sexual communication in these species. This finding strengthens the understanding of how plumage-related structures evolved not only for flight, but also for secondary functions that strongly influenced social behavior. An additional aspect that has emerged in recent studies is the discussion of the taxonomic identity of Nomingia. Research published in 2021 has suggested that Nomingia gobiensis could be a synonym of Elmisaurus rarus, a caenagnathed dinosaur described from the same formation. If this hypothesis were confirmed, it would imply that the remains attributed to Nomingia actually belong to a single taxon with morphological variations that were mistakenly interpreted as specific differences. However, this proposal is still under debate and requires more fossil evidence to be consolidated. Stygimoloch. Stygimoloch was a marginocephalian theropod dinosaur belonging to the group Pachycephalosauridae, known for its extraordinarily ornamented skull and for the controversy surrounding its own scientific identity. The name Stygimoloch means spiny demon of the river Styx, a term inspired by Greek mythology that refers to the mythical river of the underworld, thus evoking the spectacular and threatening appearance provided by the numerous horns and bony protrusions on its head. This dinosaur lived toward the end of the late Cretaceous, approximately 66 million years ago during the Maastrichtian in what is now North America, especially in regions corresponding to the Hell Creek and Lance geological formations in the United States. In these same sediments, many of the last dinosaurs before the mass extinction were preserved, including giants such as Tyrannosaurus rex and herbivores like Triceratops, with which Stygimoloch shared its habitat. Stygimoloch was formally described as a genus and type species in 1983 by paleontologists Peter Galton and Hans-Dieter Suess, based on highly distinctive cranial remains found in Montana. The type species is Stygimoloch spinifer. The discovery of these pieces, especially skull bones with complex ornamentation, was sufficient to initially distinguish the animal from other known pachycephalosaurs. In terms of size, Stygimoloch was a medium-sized dinosaur reaching approximate lengths of about 3 meters and a hip height that possibly ranged between 1.2 and 1.5 meters. Its skull alone could measure close to 46 centimeters in length, and it was equipped with a set of bony protrusions and spikes that made it stand out visually compared to other members of its group. This included short conical horns above the nose and prominent bony spikes at the posterior corners of the skull, surrounded by several smaller protrusions, forming a complex ornamentation not seen in many other pachycephalosaurs. The structure of its skull was peculiar. Although it possessed an elevated cranial dome, it was not as wide or massive as that of some better-known relatives such as Pachycephalosaurus. Instead, the dome was narrower and slightly laterally flattened, and it was surrounded by bony spines and ornamental protrusions that emphasized its visual presence. These characteristics not only initially distinguished it as a separate genus, but also suggested that it may have had important social behavior or visual display functions within its species. The thick cranial dome of pachycephalosaurs has traditionally led paleontologists to propose that these animals may have used their heads as a kind of battering ram in intraspecific combat, much like some modern horned mammals do, clashing heads to compete for territory or mates. The presence of protrusions and horns in Stygimoloch suggests that it may have used its bony adornments both to display visual aggression and in possible physical interactions, although the latter use remains debated among scientists due to variation in the robustness of the skulls. Despite these morphological distinctions, the validity of Stygimoloch as an independent genus has been the subject of debate within modern paleontology. More recent analyses suggest that many of the specimens attributed to Stygimoloch may represent juvenile or subadult stages of Pachycephalosaurus wyomingensis, a larger and more widely known pachycephalosaur, or even that Stygimoloch and another highly ornamented related genus, Dracorex, are simply growth stages within the development of Pachycephalosaurus. This hypothesis is based on comparisons of cranial bone growth patterns and on the fact that the elaborate structures of the skulls change significantly as the animals mature, thus challenging traditional taxonomic distinctions. The idea that Stygimoloch could be a juvenile synonym of Pachycephalosaurus, or that several of these names represent different stages of a single species, has gained traction, especially following studies of bone growth published since the late 2000s. According to this perspective, the horns and ornamental protrusions that characterize Stygimoloch could correspond to a juvenile or subadult phase prior to the formation of a more solid and less ornamented dome, as observed in adult specimens of Pachycephalosaurus. However, this issue has not yet been completely resolved and remains an active field of scientific discussion. Beyond taxonomy, whether Stygimoloch represents a valid genus or a juvenile stage of another dinosaur, its ecological position in the late Cretaceous ecosystem suggests that it was a bipedal herbivore adapted to moving on two strong legs with relatively long hind limbs and short forelimbs, a configuration typical of pachycephalosaurs that would have allowed it to move agilely through vegetation. Its diet, as in other members of its group, would likely have consisted of plants and low to mid-level plant material, using small teeth adapted for chewing leaves and stems. Mononykus. Mononykus was a small and extraordinarily specialized theropod dinosaur that lived at the end of the late Cretaceous, approximately between 80 and 70 million years ago in what is now Mongolia, specifically in the sediments of the Nemegt Formation of the Gobi Desert, a semi-arid environment with open plains where it coexisted with other theropods and herbivorous dinosaurs. The name Mononykus olecranus comes from Greek and means single claw, reflecting its most distinctive feature, extremely reduced forelimbs with a single functional finger ending in a large claw. This dinosaur was first described in the 1990s by Altangerel Perl, Marc Norel, Louis Chappe, and James Clark, who worked with remains collected in 1987 in Mongolia. Mononykus was small even by the standards of many theropod dinosaur species, with an estimated length of around 1 meter and a light body weight of approximately 3.5 kilograms. Its body build was light and agile, with long, slender hind legs that made it an efficient runner, probably capable of moving quickly across the plains where it lived. The structure of its body indicates that it was well adapted to an active lifestyle and to covering distances in an environment where protection from predators and the search for food required speed. One of the most surprising features of Mononykus is its extremely reduced forelimbs. Unlike most theropod dinosaurs, which display 3 functional fingers, Mononykus had a single robust finger with a prominent claw about 7.5 centimeters in length, while the other possible fingers were highly reduced or absent. This single claw was not merely an anatomical curiosity. Its shape and size have led scientists to propose various hypotheses about its function, ranging from breaking into termite mounds or insect nests to digging into soil or softwood to extract food. In comparison with its close relatives, such as Shuvuya or Parvicursor, Mononykus differed not only in the proportions of its bones and the shape of the pubic bone with a triangular cross-section, but also in details of the proportions of the bones of the feet and the forearm. These anatomical subtleties suggest that, although within the same group of Alvarezsauridae, Mononykus had a set of unique adaptations that allowed it to exploit particular ecological niches. Alvarezsaurids, like Mononykus, are a group of maniraptoran theropods that show extreme modifications of the forelimbs, with fused wrist bones similar to those of birds, a keeled sternum, and muscular yet tiny forearms. Because of these characteristics, Mononykus was initially considered by some researchers to be very closely related to birds, although it was later reclassified within the Alvarezsaurids, a specialized lineage within the Coelurosaurs, the group that also includes birds and other feathered dinosaurs. The exact function of its short arms and single claw remains a matter of scientific debate, but one of the most widely accepted hypotheses suggests that Mononykus may have used its forelimbs to break open or perforate termite mounds, insect nests, or similar structures in behavior somewhat comparable to that of modern anteaters. This idea is based both on the robustness of the forearm and on the shape of the claw, which appear to be adapted for levering or piercing actions rather than for capturing fast-moving prey or manipulating complex objects. If this hypothesis is correct, Mononykus would have been primarily insectivorous, feeding on social insect colonies such as termites or ants, although its diet may have been broader, including small invertebrates and possible carrion. In addition to its limbs, Mononykus displayed traits typical of Alvarezsaurids in the rest of its body: a long, slender tail, probably for balance and maneuverability, and hind legs adapted for running with well-developed musculature. These adaptations would have allowed it to move rapidly across open terrain in search of food, avoiding larger predators and taking advantage of ecological niches where larger dinosaurs could not compete. Although the original holotype of Mononykus is represented by a partial skeleton that lacks a complete tail and has scattered cranial fragments, anatomical reconstructions have become more accurate by integrating information from close relatives within the family Alvarezsauridae. In fact, some specimens originally assigned to Mononykus turned out to belong to other genera such as Shuvuia or Parvicursor, which has required a careful revision of the fossil remains and the phylogeny of the group as a whole. This means that many artistic reconstructions and museum displays of Mononykus were based on fossils of very close relatives, although not necessarily of the same species. Fossil evidence and comparisons with other Alvarezsaurids also suggest that Mononykus may have had a covering of primitive feathers, similar to that of many other Maniraptorans. Although no direct impressions of feathers have been found in Mononykus, fossils of relatives such as Shuvuia have preserved traces of filamentous, feather-like structures, suggesting that this dinosaur was also likely covered in some form of soft plumage that provided thermal insulation and possibly visual communication or display during courtship. The environment of the Nemegt Formation in which Mononykus lived, an ecosystem with river sediments, alluvial plains, and varied vegetation, would have offered multiple opportunities to exploit resources such as termite mounds, small invertebrates, and perhaps occasional plants or seeds, although its overall morphology points more toward an insectivorous or omnivorous diet with a strong component of social insects. Deinocheirus. Deinocheirus was one of the strangest and most unexpected dinosaurs ever discovered, a theropod of gigantic proportions that challenged decades of scientific assumptions before its true appearance and way of life were understood. Its name, Deinocheirus mirificus, means unusual, terrible hand, pointing from the very first discovery to a pair of gigantic arms, the feature that left paleontologists perplexed for a long time. The first remains were discovered in 1965 in the Nemegt Formation in the Gobi Desert by the Polish-Mongolian paleontological expedition led by Zofia Kilan-Jaworowska. Among the sedimentary rocks of the late Cretaceous appeared anterior limbs about 2.4 meters long, with robust bones and large claws, which at that time were all that was known of this animal. These arms became the holotype of the genus and species in 1970, but for almost half a century, most of the skeleton remained a mystery, making it difficult to determine what type of dinosaur they belonged to. For years, many paleontologists speculated about the identity of Deinocheirus, with interpretations as varied as considering it a large carnivorous predator or a primitive member of unknown theropods, because only the forelimbs were known. However, the discovery and description in 2014 of two much more complete specimens completely revolutionized this view, allowing its anatomy to be reconstructed and identifying it with certainty as a primitive ornithomimosaur, a type of theropod usually light and bipedal, related to dinosaurs often referred to as ostrich dinosaurs. Deinocheirus was the largest known member of the ornithomimosaurs, reaching lengths of around 11 meters and an estimated weight between 6.3 and 7 tons, making it one of the most massive theropod dinosaurs known outside the classic carnivorous lineages. Its body was massive and robust, with hollow, partially pneumatic bones filled with air sacs that helped reduce overall weight relative to its size. In addition to its colossal arms, Deinocheirus possessed a series of unusual anatomical traits. Its arms were among the longest of any bipedal dinosaur, each with 3 fingers ending in blunt, powerful claws that do not appear designed for tearing fast-moving prey, but more likely for digging, tearing up, or gathering vegetation. The legs were relatively short, with also blunt claws, indicating that the animal was not adapted for fast running, unlike other smaller ornithomimosaurs. A series of tall neural spines on the dorsal vertebrae formed a kind of sail or hump along the back, a feature reminiscent of other dinosaurs with unusual dorsal structures. This structure may have been of biomechanical or display importance, although there is no complete consensus regarding its exact function. At the end of the tail, vertebrae fused into a structure similar to a pygostyle suggest that Deinocheirus probably supported a fan of feathers on its tail, a trait shared with other feathered theropods closely related to birds. The complete skull of Deinocheirus, finally described thanks to the discovery of more complete specimens, was long and narrow, ending in a broad beak similar to that of hadrosaurs. Its lower jaw was deep, which, together with the shape of the skull, indicates particular feeding adaptations. The absence of teeth and the morphology of the beak do not match those of large predatory theropods, but instead point to a diet that included both plants and animal matter. That is, Deinocheirus was likely omnivorous. This omnivorous behavior is supported by the presence of fish scales associated with one of the specimens and by the large quantity of gastroliths, stones ingested to help grind food, found in the abdominal area of another. Such findings suggest that its diet combined soft vegetation, fish, and perhaps other small animals or diverse plant matter, something consistent with a lifestyle in fluvial or swampy environments. The reconstruction of Deinocheirus has also shed light on its posture and locomotion. Although it was bipedal, it walked with the body relatively low and the tail extended backward to balance its enormous torso and powerful forelimbs. Its robust structure suggests that it was not a fast runner like other ornithomimosaurs, but rather an animal capable of supporting an enormous body volume while moving through varied landscapes, including floodplains, wetlands, and areas near rivers where food resources were abundant. Before additional remains were found in 2014, the mystery of its anatomy led to numerous erroneous interpretations, including the idea that it was a large carnivorous predator or even forms only distantly related to ornithomimosaurs. Confirmation of its true identity led to the creation of the family Deinocheiridae, which includes Deinocheirus along with other primitive genera of the lineage such as Garudimimus and Beishanlong. Unlike other ornithomimosaurs, members of this family lacked clear adaptations for speed and were specialized in different ways of life, reflecting the ecological diversity of Cretaceous theropods. The study of Deinocheirus has also shown that the most common dinosaurs in the formations of Mongolia were part of rich and complex ecosystems, with large herbivores such as hadrosaurs, ceratopsians, and sauropods coexisting with specialized theropods and formidable predators like Tarbosaurus, whose bite marks have been identified on some fossil remains of Deinocheirus, although it is not clear whether those encounters involved active predation or scavenging. Pachyrhinosaurus. Pachyrhinosaurus was a truly singular theropod dinosaur that lived during the early Cretaceous, approximately 125 million years ago, in what is now China, specifically in the rich strata of the Yixian Formation in Liaoning Province. Its discovery provided key pieces for understanding the evolution of herbivorous dinosaurs within the group of theropods, which were mostly carnivorous, as well as the development of body structures that would later give rise to the feathers of modern birds. The name Pachyrhinosaurus inexpectus means unexpected Beipiao lizard, in reference to the city of Beipiao, near the site where the first fossil was found, and to the surprising set of anatomical characteristics that challenged the expectations of paleontologists when it was formally described in 1999 by Xu Xing, Tang Jilu, and Wang Xiaolin. Pachyrhinosaurus was a primitive member of the Therizinosauridae, a group of theropods that, unlike their carnivorous relatives, evolved toward adaptations more typical of herbivores or omnivores. While many of its later relatives, such as Therizinosaurus, reached enormous sizes and developed colossal claws, Pachyrhinosaurus was much more modest in proportions, with an estimated length of about 2.2 meters and a weight of around 85 kilograms, placing it within the size range of a tall human or a large quadrupedal animal. Morphologically, the skeleton of Pachyrhinosaurus combines traits typical of theropods with unique innovations. Its head and jaw were adapted to a plant-based or possibly omnivorous diet. It possessed a toothless beak at the front of the jaw, accompanied farther back by small leaf-shaped teeth suitable for chewing vegetation. This combination suggests that the animal could cut and process plant material, although not with the same sophistication as more specialized herbivores, which may indicate a mixed or generalist diet. The arms of Pachyrhinosaurus were long and ended in hands with 3 fingers equipped with relatively large claws, although not as exaggerated as those of its later Therizinosaur relatives. These limbs may have been used to strip leaves, manipulate vegetation, or even defend against larger predators, although there is no total consensus among researchers regarding their primary function. One of the most important characteristics of Pachyrhinosaurus is the fossil evidence of a covering of primitive feathers over the body, probably composed of 2 types of structures, a layer of soft, woolly filaments and a second set of longer and simpler filaments emerging above the inner layer. These filaments, known as broad and elongated filamentous feathers, represent one of the earliest and best-preserved examples of complex plumage in dinosaurs outside the direct lineage of birds. These feathery structures were simple and not branched like modern flight feathers, but they nonetheless provide evidence that plumage was a common feature in several theropods long before the evolution of flight. The impressions of down show that the feathers on the body of Pachyrhinosaurus were oriented perpendicular to the arms and torso, suggesting that they may have served for thermal insulation, visual display, or communication rather than for flight. An additional fascinating trait is the presence of a pygostyle, a bony structure at the end of the tail formed by fused vertebrae, which in modern birds serves as an anchoring point for tail feathers. Although complete long tail feathers are not preserved in Pachyrhinosaurus, the presence of this element indicates that the anatomy needed to support a fan of feathers was already developing in this group of dinosaurs. The neck of Pachyrhinosaurus was relatively shorter compared to other more derived therizinosaurids, and its body may have had a somewhat more robust or pot-bellied shape, although not as exaggerated as in later forms. This reinforces the idea of an animal adapted to an ecological niche in which it combined plant foraging with the mobility necessary to move among varied vegetation and possibly explore different food resources within its environment. The feet of Pachyrhinosaurus were tridactyl, that is, with 3 functional toes, unlike other more evolved therizinosaurids that had 4 toes on the foot. This trait places Pachyrhinosaurus in a more basal position within its group, suggesting that many of the derived characteristics of therizinosaurids arose later in the evolution of this lineage. The discovery of Pachyrhinosaurus began with a chance find in 1996 by a farmer near the locality of Sihetun, followed by scientific recognition and formal description in 1999. The initial fossil material included a partial skeleton of a subadult with cranial fragments, vertebrae, ribs, parts of the arm, and elements of the pelvis and legs, as well as plumage impressions that proved fundamental for interpreting its biology. Subsequently, a second specimen preserved a more detailed feather covering and made it possible to describe the diversity of plumose structures present in this species. The Yixian Formation, where Pachyrhinosaurus was found, is part of the famous Jehol biota, an exceptionally rich fossil deposit that has preserved fine details of dinosaurs, primitive birds, reptiles, early mammals, and plants. The climate of this region during the early Cretaceous combined warm conditions with drier and colder seasons, which may have favored the evolution of plumage as a means of thermal insulation in several dinosaurs that lived there. Concavenator. Concavenator was a very unusual carnivorous theropod dinosaur that lived at the beginning of the Cretaceous, approximately 130 million years ago, in what is now Spain, specifically in the region of Cuenca, in sediments of the La Juerguina Formation at the Las Hoyas site. The genus name Concavenator corcovatus translates as hunchbacked hunter of Cuenca, or literally Cuenca hunter with a hump. And the epithet corcovatus refers to the peculiar elevated dorsal structure of its vertebral column. Concavenator is the only species represented within its genus and is known from a nearly complete articulated skeleton, one of the most complete and best preserved theropod fossils ever found in Europe. This exceptional preservation allowed paleontologists to reconstruct its morphology in detail and to propose hypotheses about its biology and evolution. It measured approximately 5 to 6 meters in length and weighed around 300 to 700 kilograms, placing it in the category of medium-sized theropods with a robust body build but at the same time relatively light for a bipedal carnivore. Its skull was long and narrow, with serrated teeth designed for cutting flesh, clearly indicating a carnivorous diet consisting of smaller prey or the soft parts of larger animals. The most striking structure in Concavenator is the series of elongated neural spines on the lumbar and dorsal vertebrae near the hips, which form a crest or hump on the animal's back. These spines are much taller than those of other vertebrae and may have supported a raised skin structure or a fat deposit similar in function to that of modern camels, although it has also been suggested that they could have served for visual display among individuals of the species, for example during courtship or to recognize members of the same species. The exact function of this hump is still not entirely clear. Researchers have proposed that it may have had several combined functions, including thermoregulation, energy storage in the form of fat, visual signaling, or even a role in social behaviors. The shape and position of the spines do not suggest a broad, continuous sail like that of Spinosaurus, but rather a much more compact and prominent triangular crest over the lumbar vertebrae. Another surprising feature of Concavenator is the presence of small protuberances on the forearm bones that could be homologous to the quill knobs observed in modern birds. In birds, these knobs are attachment points for ligaments that support flight feathers, and although no feathers have been directly preserved in Concavenator, the bone marks have led some scientists to propose that this dinosaur may have had primitive feather-like structures on its arms, which would extend the presence of feather-related integuments beyond the groups of dinosaurs traditionally considered feathered. This finding, although debated, was so significant that it forced a reconsideration of the chronology and evolutionary distribution of feathers or similar structures in large theropod dinosaurs, since Concavenator is a carcharodontosaurid, a lineage of theropods more closely related to giant predators such as Giganotosaurus or Carcharodontosaurus than to the traditionally feathered coelurosaurs. From a paleoecological perspective, Concavenator inhabited an ecosystem of lakes, ponds, and tropical or subtropical wetlands during the Barremian stage of the early Cretaceous, surrounded by a diverse fauna of fish, crustaceans, amphibians, turtles, small crocodiles, and other dinosaurs. Among its contemporaries were small theropods, ornithischians, and various forms that shared resources in a landscape of abundant vegetation and intermittent bodies of water. Analysis of its phylogenetic position places it within the Carcharodontosauridae, a group of carnivorous theropods that includes some of the largest predators recorded in the fossil record. However, Concavenator represents a more basal and moderately sized form within this lineage, providing valuable information about the early diversification of these great predators. The discovery of Concavenator dates back to 2003, when Spanish paleontologists José Luis Sanz, Francisco Ortega, and Fernando Escaso located the remains at Las Joyas. After years of preparation and study, the species was formally described and published in 2010 in the journal Nature, becoming a milestone in European paleontology as one of the most complete theropod dinosaur remains ever recovered in the Iberian Peninsula. The fossil remains are so well preserved that they have even retained impressions of scales and soft tissues, such as plantar pads and dermal structures, providing exceptional details about the skin and surface anatomy of the animal beyond the traditional bony fossil record.